Everybody can have a seat. We're going to continue with the next part of our program, which is Olga Gershenson, who will be speaking about the Holocaust in Soviet film and television. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Gershenson. She is Associate Professor of Judaic and Nursing Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. She got her BA in Russia and her MA in Israel and her PhD in the US, so she's multicultural. Her personal geography parallels her academic path. Okay, can you write those names down? Her personal geography parallels her academic path, tracking tracking Russian Jewish culture at home and abroad. And for years she's followed a Russian immigrant culture production in Israel. She published Gesher, Russian Theater in Israel, about a unique bilingual theater in Tel Aviv, and a series of articles about Russian Israeli cinema. She then detoured to studying gender and power relations and published a collection, Ladies and Gents, Public Toilets and Gender. And back on her Russian Jewish track, she recently published a book about the unknown, forgotten, or banned Holocaust films in the Soviet Union, The Phantom Holocaust, Soviet Cinema, and Jewish Catastrophe. It was published this year. She teaches courses on Jewish cultural studies, such as Jewish theater and film, or Israeli and Palestinian popular cultures, and lectures at universities, film festivals, and other cultural events. And we're delighted that she's joining us today and taking time off of her busy schedule. And I would just like to point out that this actually dovetails nicely with what Josh Rubenstein was talking about with Ilya Ehrenberg and the literary culture. Now we're going to see some aspects of visual culture as well. So please join me in welcoming Olga Gershenson.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me?
No.
How about this?
Much better.
Much better. Okay, that's what I wanted to hear. So, thank you for inviting me. Okay, so if I ask you to name, let us say an American Holocaust movie, most of you probably would say, oh, Schindler's List. If I ask you to name a European Holocaust movie, many of you would say, Life is Beautiful or something like that. But if I ask you to name me a Russian Holocaust movie, what would you say? Why is there no Russian Schindler's List? So the assumption is that the Soviet Union just didn't allow the subject, that there were no Holocaust movies, or, as a matter of fact, any other way of commemorating the Holocaust. So, and in many ways it's true. But it's also only a partial picture. So, it's true that the Soviets silenced the Holocaust. You know what, let me just move this thing a little bit. Sorry about this. Okay. Because I need to have access to my notes into that computer. So, it is true that the Soviets silenced the Holocaust. They didn't exactly deny it. Instead, they universalized and externalized it. What does that mean? By universalization, I understand naming, including Jews in the overall Soviet tragedy, and naming the Jews as, peaceful Soviet citizens. And that way, we don't need to speak about the Holocaust as a particular Jewish tragedy. And by externalization, I understand speaking about the Holocaust as if it's located only in Poland and Germany or other places outside of the borders of the Soviet Union. And that is also very convenient because then we don't need to deal with collaboration or bystanders, right? And it's much less comfortable, much more comfortable, right? As a result, there was no official commemoration of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, and even the word Holocaust itself, as you probably know, was not used, so the particular Jewish loss had no name. And yet, that's not the whole story. writers, poets, photographers, artists dealt with the subject even at the most inhospitable social climes. Amazingly, some of their creative output was published and circulated, and in fact, I would argue that it is only through arts and culture that the memory of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union was somehow kept alive. Among this artistic output were also several films about the Holocaust. And this is where it gets interesting. Paradoxically, the Soviets were actually among the first to represent the Holocaust, so rather to expose the Nazi anti-Semitism. So in many ways, they were ahead of the game. In 1938, way before the Hollywood, let us say, dared to deal with the subject, the Soviets made not one, not two, but 3 films that attacked the policies of Nazi anti-Semitism. Of course, all these 3 movies were later banned as soon as Stalin signed a pact with Hitler. The first Soviet film about the executions, the Nazi executions on Soviet soil, then vanquished, came out also very early in 1945, which means that it was made in 1944. Of course, it was also soon taken off the screens as soon as Stalin became more and more anti-Semitic. But the bulk of the Soviet Holocaust films were made or written at least in 1960s during the period of post-Stalin liberalization, commonly known as the thaw, Khrushchev's thaw. But even during this sort of relatively liberal time, several Holocaust screenplays were rejected by Soviet censors, and they were not made into films, and I call this whole cycle, sort of this unmade film, phantom cinema. But these relatively liberal times come to an end with the 1967 war in Israel and with 1968 suppression of uprising in Czechoslovakia, and then the Jewish subject in the Soviet Union becomes completely off limits. And it remained so for many, many years, only until perestroika, which is kind of right before the end of the Soviet Union. Jewish topics returned to screens, and then there are actually several films that deal with the Holocaust made. Okay, so now we can finally get to the films. Today I'll show you clips from the least known and the more amazing of these movies. And I want us to think about the question, what is the picture of the Holocaust that emerges in these films? And I'll try to speak both about the unique features of the Holocaust on Soviet soil and how these unique features were reflected in these films. So let's start with the fact that the Jewish catastrophe coincided on Soviet soil with Stalin's repressions, the purges of the late 1930s, and then the post-war anti-Semitic campaigns. Interestingly, Soviet films, unlike Western films that you might be more familiar with, draw parallels between Hitler and Stalin, or between the Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia, for their respective crimes, including anti-Semitic policies. So let's see a scene from one of the earliest films that I mentioned before, Professor Mammoth from 1938. It's a story of a Jewish physician in Nazi Germany. As you watch it, think, how is Nazi anti-Semitism portrayed in this little excerpt? The subtitles come closer, maybe. Let's see.
I'm gonna turn it up.
No.
старший врач Карл. Вы так выполняете мои распоряжения?
Что вы говорите, доктор Гербер?
Операцию будет делать доктор Карл. А вам предлагаю немедленно покинуть клинику.
Что тут? Я ничего не понимаю. Доктор Гербер, вы превышаете ваши полномочия.
Доктор Карл, я сказал, операцию делаете вы.
Доктор Гербер, вы не мешаете работать.
Напоминаю вторично. В ваших услугах мы не нуждаемся.
Доктор Гербер, за работу в клинике отвечаю я. Немедленно уходите отсюда.
Ицек распоряжается. Трепещите внимание! Ицек хочет выгнать нас отсюда. Он продал Германию французам! Евреи! Евреи! Он свергает германскую науку! Евреи! Евреи!
Убирайтесь вон отсюда! Убирайтесь вон!
Спокойно? Снимаю. Вот это левая. Лево! Владимир.
So I want to remind you that this film is made in 1938 at a Soviet studio. Interestingly enough, the action takes place in Germany. But if we watch the entire film, we will see many parallels between the events at home and things that are depicted in the film. So under the guise of the fascist Germany, we see the realities of Stalin's regimes, such as arrests, disappearances, slave labor in camps, and of course anti-Semitism. I also should note that Professor Mamlet is based on a German Jewish play by Friedrich Wolf. But the film makes a considerable effort to translate from sort of this German Jewish idiom into the local understandable realities. For instance, in this brief scene that you've seen, a German Jew, Hans Mamlock, whose name sounds anything but Jewish to a Russian ear, is transformed by this taunting Nazi into Itzek, you know, like a shtetl little Isaac, little Jew. And that translates this dialogue or this reality into the understandable Russian anti-Semitic idiom. So makes it, you know, this scene because of that reference to Itzik, this shtetl Isaac, becomes all of a sudden more relevant to the events at home and not just to the critique of Nazi anti-Semitism. So, this is something unique to Soviet Holocaust films, that they condemn anti-Semitism not only in Hitler's Germany, but also in Stalin's Russia. Let's now turn to another distinct part of the Soviet Holocaust history. As you, I'm sure, know, in the Soviet Union, Jews were murdered predominantly in or near their hometowns by this Einsatz group and these special units. They were rarely sent to camps. So one would expect that such brutal executions would be a hallmark of the Holocaust in Soviet cinema. But to my surprise, this is not so. Because of this mechanism of silencing that I mentioned before, universalizing and externalizing, we rarely see the actual events of the Holocaust depicted on Soviet soil or in a Soviet film. And when we do, it is so remarkable that we should look at it closely. So, what does the local, authentic picture of the Holocaust look like? Let's look at another very, very early film, 1945, The Unvanquished, made by very famous Soviet ethnically Jewish director Mark Donskoy. The film depicts events in 1941 Kiev and features an execution that actually was filmed on location in Babi Yar, a place that came to symbolize the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. Interestingly enough, Donskoy was, he was ethnically Jewish, but was very much a Soviet filmmaker. But when he was making this film, he cast his own son, here is little Sasha Donskoy on your right, as one of the victims, so that shows you a level of identification. And also, he cast one of the greatest Russian Yiddish performers, actors, Benjamin Zuskin, in one of the main roles, and so that also gives you the kind of level of his serious, engagement with that. So I want to show you this Babi Yar scene, and as you watch, think, how does a director convey the horror? How does he depict that scene? Mind you, with talking, the film is released in 1945, which means that it's been written and filmed in 1944. Very early. This is So Donskoy is making this in 1944 newly liberated Kiev. How do you represent such an atrocity on screen? There are a few models, there are no models in fact. It's not clear at all how to represent such a thing. And we know for a fact that he talked with survivors and witnesses, and he knew how exactly that execution took place. And if you look at this excerpt, you will notice that it's not historically accurate. People were in fact, undressed and they were executed right on the edge of the, right in the ravine, and they fell. So Donskoy makes very deliberate choice here to go away from historical accuracy. What is he doing there? Because he was looking for artistic language to represent this brutal violence, he goes to a model of visual violence that he knows from Russian Soviet cinema. The scene in a very, very famous film, Battleship Potemkin by Sergei Eisenstein, that if you ever taken a film class, you've seen this film. In this film, Kazakhs are executing the revolting sailors in public, and so you will see that it's the same scene. So, why is he doing that? Interestingly enough, so this is because this is the picture of ultimate violence for Soviet army. But there is an interesting sub-story to that. The famous scene in Potemkin that I'm showing the stills from here is actually inspired by anti-Jewish violence. In 1905, Sergei Eisenstein witnessed a pogrom, and the experience made such an impact on him that he actually wrote initially a scene of pogrom into Potemkin. It was later edited out, but this scene is specifically influenced by pogrom imagery, so it kind of is a closing of circles, So in a way, the picture of the Holocaust on Soviet screen harks back to that pogrom imagery, to that earlier anti-Jewish violence. So this is something pretty unique into the Soviet imagination. So let's look at a later film that also depicts an execution of Jews on Soviet soil. Again, I apologize, this is fictional narratives, but they're very graphic imagery, and nothing we can do about that. So, a later film, also extremely interesting, and I think best film in all, in my opinion, called Eastern Corridor. It was made by not Jewish, not a very famous director, Valentin Vinogradov, in 1966. And the film basically is about the Holocaust in Minsk, or around Minsk, in Belarus. And the particular scene that I'm going to show to you now depicts an execution of Jews somewhere around Minsk ghetto. So again, as you watch it, pay attention. How does the filmmaker convey these horrid events? Also, in this particular case, I will ask you to also listen to the soundtrack and the dialogue. It's interesting. There are no subtitles here, it's unnecessary.
der Feind. Und steht vor dir, Israel, dein Tochter Roch. Komm, nimm sie, was ruft sie?
So, I can hear you talking about that, that's great. So, Vinogradov, as you saw, again, it is completely unhistorical. Though we do know that in some places Nazis drowned people or executed Jews in the river. But in particular location in Belarus, that didn't happen. They invented it. I spoke to Vinogradov and he told me that the real stories that they learned from survivors or witnesses was so horrid that they wanted to create something else visually because they wanted to walk away from desecration of the memory of people who died this way and, not to depict something, very accurate like a documentary film. So instead of depicting the horrors that really occurred, he creates this sort of mythological depiction of execution with very symbolic, with water, light, darkness. It was very unusual for both the Holocaust film and the Soviet films, certainly of that time. So the symbolic imagery of this scene is actually reminiscent of a famous scene from another Russian film, very influential at the time, Andrei Rublev by Andrei Tarkovsky. It's a very different film, has nothing to do with Holocaust. But, note how I said that Donskoy goes to Eisenstein, so Vinogradov goes to another great master for that visual language of symbolism and, heavy-duty emotions, because this is how they think. So this is something very interesting, that the authentic Soviet Holocaust imagery is created through powerful cinematic references. So the filmmakers go away from historical reality in order to make a greater emotional impact on their audiences. So now I want to let's go back to Eastern Corridor and talk about the soundtrack we heard, the sounds in the film. So we heard this very multi-layered, right, that we hear rush of water and children screaming and a cantor's voice. If you listen carefully, you will recognize, did anyone recognize the prayer?
Yes.
Tsure Soel, right, which usually after the Shema, right, and it's very much, so
very deep in Israel.
correct. So it's very much a prayer of redemption, of plea for deliverance, and so it is with this prayer, unthinkable. In Soviet film in 1966, Jews died on screen. But it gets even more bizarre because then this naked young woman, very beautiful, comes out of this crowd of praying Jews in taluses, and we hear a new musical theme, a somber church organ music. And then she faces the camera and says in Yiddish, and there was no translation into Russian, but that's why I didn't put any translation. But what she says is, God, you see our pain, master of the universe. Here stands in front of you, Israel, your daughter, Rachel, Bochel. Take her and make her fertile. So this is very strange, to say the least, moment, right? Because of course, we can perceive here some Jewish references, but even more so, there are Christian references. Correct? So how do we explain that? This is crazy. What's Christian about that? Think about how the mother of Jesus. Correct, but she was also impregnated, there was kind of. So, it's a. Correct. So how do we explain that? So yeah, we can address this in Q&A. The Q&A is my favorite part. I promise to leave it open. So most of the films, how do we explain this? Why do we see, it's such a Jewish moment, right? Here we see Tzur Israel and all these Jews and Talmuses and this, and Ribono Shel Olam, and then all of a sudden there are plenty of other Christian allusions in this film, just trust me. So, so how do we understand that? So in many ways, these films reflect the kind of transformation of Jewish identity that has been taking place in the Soviet Union. Because to various degrees, Soviet Jews by 1966 were assimilated, secularized, Russified, to different degrees, right? And references to Judaism in a film, were not happening, not only because they were forbidden, even though, sometimes they but also because who would understand it? And so this is why, even if we see Hebrew liturgy, which is very peculiar, we also, this is more of an exception than a rule, and to a degree to which Soviet Holocaust films refer to Judaism as a religion, they refer to Christianity even more. Whether they're made by Jewish filmmakers or not by Jewish filmmakers, doesn't matter. Even if you think about some bits of imagery from the Unvanquished, this Babi Yar movie, the Jewish woman who is about to be executed holding her baby to her breast, it's a Madonna. It's very much visually a Christian imagery. So, and that is in every film. Now, this is not unique to, let me finish, we otherwise have a great discussion. So, this is not unique to Soviet cinema in any way. As other scholars point out, in Hollywood, for instance, there are lots of references in Holocaust films to Christian ideas and symbolism in representing the Holocaust. But in particular Soviet context, Christian symbolism includes Jews into kind of the common cultural context, making their story resonant and clear for non-Jews. But in doing that, it also universalizes a particular Jewish story and kind of takes away from it. So it's a complicated story. But overall, these films that I've shown to you now, they are, this kind of imagery, this kind of pictures and sounds are rare. Predominantly, the representation of the Holocaust on Soviet screen is externalized. So to a degree to which Soviet films engage with the subject of the Holocaust, they portrayed it as happening elsewhere, not here. So let's watch a fairly typical excerpt, very powerful, I think, still, from a classic Soviet film, The Fate of a Man, made in Moscow in 1959. It was a very, very powerful film. In the center of the main character is this Russian prisoner of war, ethnically Russian prisoner of war, and who arrives at a certain point in his trials and tribulation to a concentration camp. And so I'm going to show you a little clip where this Russian man arrives at a concentration camp. And again, just see what kind of Jews he encounters there. So this is Russian prisoner.
Внимание, внимание! Все прибывшие в лагерь хранят полное спокойствие. Приказываю русским военным пленам следовать рода молодых. Всем лицам еврейского национальности рода номер 2. Остальные следуют рода номер 3.
So you can see that, of course, the entire film is not about the Holocaust at all, and not about Jews, right? So this is just a little tiny subplot. Sort of everyone suffered, among them, you know. And the action does not take place on Soviet soil. There are no Soviet Jews in this film whatsoever. It's in German camp, and the Western or Polish Jews who are, sent to this crematoria. And what you see now is the kind of classic Holocaust imagery that's familiar to us from, Western, right? You said it, right? The chimney, the barbed wire, the striped uniform, and in fact, similar externalized images appeared at that time in several other very good Soviet films, Ordinary Fascism, Goodbye Boys, Sons of the Fatherland, I could name some more. So conveniently, these images are iconic of the Holocaust, they're very, very powerful, but also they fit well with the Soviet policy of externalization, right? We don't need to deal with what happened here. We don't need to take historic responsibility. It's over there. Now, somewhere in between this kind of localized imagery that we see in Eastern Corridor and Anvankash, and this sort of totally externalized images, which is mainly very camp-based. Also films like a very, very famous Commissar by Olga that create kind of composite picture. The Commissar is a good example because it's not even a Holocaust film. The action takes place in Russian Civil War, but there is a very famous scene there where a Russian commissar woman has a flash forward, has sort of this prophecy of the Holocaust. So see how is this kind of Jewish tragedy portrayed here, and how does this create that? traditions come together. It's a very dreamy sequence, also very symbolic, completely unrealistic. And you see this, and the action takes place actually in this, Russian Soviet time. And you see this procession of Jews march to their death, almost like in the Vanquish. But when they arrive at their destination point, it's some sort of prisoner camp, and then you see this, inmates in striped uniforms, and you even see a crematory chimney with a small building from it. So you can see how this filmmaker takes from both idioms, right, to bring about this strong emotional impact. And the same with music, right? You notice also that there are some Jewish elements, and then there are some very much sort of church song organ music. So this sort of both the Christian and the Jewish tradition. And another, totally not something different, totally unique feature of Soviet Jewish history, also reflected in films, was that about 500,000 of Soviet Jews fought in the Red Army, and several 100,000 also fought in various partisan units. Now, of course, we can say that, oh, these Jews fought as Soviets, they were certainly recruited as Soviets, but historians say that also their Jewish identification very much played into that, because they knew that the Nazis are executing Jews, they had news from home, and also because they were themselves experiencing Stalin's domestic anti-Semitism increasingly as the war was progressing. So interesting enough, so basically the story of a Jewish soldier in the Soviet context is very much connected with the story of the Holocaust. Interestingly, a relatively large number of movies reflecting sort of this Jewish military effort appeared throughout the years. Some of them as early as mid-40s. There were two significant movies came out very early, Wait For Me and Two Fighters. Both featured this very charismatic Jewish characters who, just kind of completely grabbed people's attention and became very much favorite, beloved characters. What's interesting here is that the Soviet movies, by featuring this figure of a Jewish soldier, especially such a winning character, undermine the Western canon of representing Jews as passive victims. So the figure of a Soviet Jewish soldier models Jews as an active fighter and resistor, but it's also a comment, again, on Soviet anti-Semitism, right? This winning character of Jewish fighter is also a comment of a filmmaker on the stigma of Jews as unfit for military service that they might have themselves experienced if they were Jewish, or if they perceived through others if they were not. So let's consider a case of Soldiers, very powerful film, which features the main character of Officer Farber. Here he's depicted in his little glasses. And I'm going to show to you, and he's very clearly Jewish, and I'm going to show you a clip where Farber speaks to his Russian comrades, in between the fighting. So it's the it's mid-40s, and it's a battle for Stalingrad. So that's the context, the military context. So observe how Farber is portrayed.
Да вот, пулеметы заправлю. Пулеметами солдат займется. А ты командир. Поди-ка, залезь. Ну, Сталине тоже таким был.
Каким?
Да вот таким. Пить не любишь, ругаться не умеешь. Что ж не любишь? Баб любишь. Ты не обижайся, но я вот смотрю на тебя и не пойму. Ей-богу. Командир роты, офицера. Ну что ты умеешь? Плавать умеешь?
Нет, не умею.
Подожди себе.
И велосипеде не умею.
Ну. Но в морду давал кому-нибудь?
Давал.
О, кому?
Мне все ли равно? Простите. Я пойду, Юрий Михайлович.
Тоже вот с высшим образованием, а понятие имеет.
So Farber here is portrayed, as we saw, as a quintessential what the cultural studies scholars call Jewish sissy, right? A far cry from this easy masculinity and bravado of the soldiers surrounding him. So he's in ill-fitted uniform, his glasses are broken, he moves awkwardly and speaks in this hyper-polite way that is completely inappropriate in the trenches. And yet, in this film, it is this Jewish nerd who stands up to an evil Stalinist and defeats him. He becomes a brilliant commander and wins a battle. And so this Jewish sissy prevails, and the film really reasserts this kind of alternative masculinity. At the end, it is Farber who leads these guys into a winning battle. So, now that we talked about what was there, what was depicted on Soviet screens, let's also talk really briefly what is not there, because it's also interesting. What have we not seen? Interestingly enough, evacuation and escape, the very important chapters in the Soviet Jewish history that saved probably millions of lives, are never or almost never depicted on screen. And this is a separate conversation, why not. Holocaust survivors after the war, their trauma, experience of return, of survival, never. And this is particularly striking if you think about a number of Western films that talk about the aftermath of the Holocaust and about survivors. In also noticeably, there is no generic diversity. There are no, let us say, Holocaust for young audiences. There are no Holocaust comedies. There are no Holocaust fantasies. On the plus side, there is also, no Nazi exploitation movie, the Holocaust porn, all of that. So that was luckily not there. In the Soviet Union, the Holocaust films were a serious and solemn business. And this is for a good reason. Western Holocaust films, especially the Hollywood ones, often have happy ends. They focus on an inspiring story. Think about Schindler's List. In contrast, Soviet films can tolerate a greater degree of tragedy with Jewish characters executed or dead. Jewish corpses on screen do not invite a redemption narrative. And of course, the rhetoric of redemption in Zion, of rebuilding Jewish life and Jewish state, is also a non-starter in Soviet context. Finally, let me say a few words about censorship. Soviets not only discouraged the production of films dealing with the Holocaust, but also, even when they were made, prevented the distribution. Most filmmakers complied, but some didn't. As a result of this, Soviet war films ranged from the movies that don't touch upon Holocaust at all, as if Jews simply did not exist, never, to the films, which is, the larger square, right? To the films which focus on the Jewish catastrophe, such as some of the films that I showed to you today. The first category of movies encountered little to no censorship problems. The films in the smallest square, right, were very rarely made, and for the most part remained scripts, right, the phantom cinema that I mentioned. In between, there were films that, most of them I discussed today, basically. They're films that feature the Holocaust as a plotline, or it is somewhere on the margins of the narrative, and yet even these films were often deemed too Jewish by Soviet censors, and so they were erased from the Soviet film history, which is why they are, forgotten in the former Soviet Union and now are unknown in the West. So which brings me to my point, right? That it is important that we watch them, that we teach them, and that we bring them back from that region. I will end on this sort of teaching note, because it's really difficult to get these films and to see them. They're not available in English subtitles. I put together this website with these films. Actually, there were more movie clips. Some of them I showed to you today, many of them I haven't. So this is and I wanted to briefly show it to you. So this is a clip from a movie. This is Professor Mandel, for instance. And here you have a little introduction about the film, and here you have discussion questions that you might or might not want to use when you work on your lesson plan, something like that. So,
This is your website? What's the website?
It's called phantomholocaust.org, and the reference to the website is in the book, and I'm happy to email it, of course. So, and now I would like to open this for Q&A, and also I see that some people are online, and I'm also interested in hearing any feedback that you guys might have to the website, because I want to make it user-friendly for educators.
So let me ask
Thank
you
you.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, let me get your attention. So first of all, I want to thank Dr. Gershenson for fantastic presentation. She also, Professor Weinberg has to leave, and Professor Gershenson has to leave. Let's take just 5 minutes now and not a break. Just 5 minutes for Q&A, and then we're going to go directly to Professor Weinberg's concluding remarks about the fate, the legacy of the Holocaust in the post-Soviet, the former Soviet Union. Okay, so just really 5 minutes because we're really running out of time, and I promised Professor Weinberg that we'd get him out on a timely basis. So questions?
In terms of any kind of Christian, in terms of any kind of Christian influence,
I can't hear you, so I'm
in
sorry.
terms of any kind of Christian influences or things, my question is this: I don't mean it's not theological, but given the fact that Russia follows the Orthodox Christian philosophy, are there any themes in East Orthodox religion, specific themes, aside from Westminster Catholicism, that have influenced any of the Holocaust films?
sorry, I didn't understand the question. Can we just ask quicker, faster questions?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
trying to
something
say
about
that
films.
when you say Christian influences, I'm here just to ask a question. The fact that Christianity in the Eastern Orthodox sense has some differences from Christianity in the Western Christian sense. My only question is, are there any themes or philosophies or figures or anything that are more particularly true of the Eastern Orthodox Church?
I have no idea. I'm sorry. Can we focus on films and not on Orthodox Eastern religion? Because I
Yeah,
just
you
am
know
not
what,
so specialist.
if you send me an email, I'll forward it to Professor Gershenson.
So no. But I'm out of my depth here.
Do we have any other questions? All right, so let me say, go
I'll say
ahead.
one thing really quick. We read in some of the readings that the Americans were in denial, the journalists weren't believing reports, and yet in the Soviet Union they were already making films as that early about the Holocaust, which I think is, for me, amazing and shocking. That they so early that they were already making films about it.
And it's interesting that these films all played in New York and all over the world, you know, and like Mammoth had a great play, and not only by Daily Worker, but like regular newspapers. People really were very impressed with it. It's not a bad film.
See
Yeah,
why?
yes.
I'd like to know, was Professor Mamluk, the film Mamluk, done after the 28th November?
Before November 1938, it premiered literally the next day after Kristallnacht.
That's what I meant.
So the reviews, but it was done before. So the reviews, it was amazing to see the Soviet newspapers because the reports of Kristallnacht
That's what
are published side by side with reviews of Mamluk. It's
And
unbelievable.
And Oppenheimer.
Huh?
And the
coincidence.
film Oppenheimer, family Oppenheimer.
And, right, that was a little bit later. Right, absolutely. Yes.
Just a comment. Remember that Charlie Chaplin produced in 1940, The Great Dictator.
Yeah,
So
that's-
that you can't, to assume that there's no reference.
Oh, but Charlie Chaplin was independent, it's not
No,
Hollywood.
I agree. It's just only that I'm saying the idea that people were aware of what was taking place and relating to it is clearly.
Oh, for sure.
We went against industry.
Right,
Okay?
right.
There's an excellent film on this called Silent Witness by Daniel who deals with America's response in film to the Holocaust. Excellent.
Imaginary Witness.
Imaginary Witness.
It's called Imaginary Witness, yes.
Imaginary Witness.
All right, I'm sorry to cut Professor Gershenson off. I want to say that this site, because these things are hard to find, it's really very, very useful. And I thought those were fantastic clips. So I really recommend everybody, if you want, I will send it around to you. But let's give it a round of applause.
Yeah. Also, I would be really thankful if you could maybe send my email. If you guys have any feedback about this website, as educators, I want to learn about it because I will improve it, I will develop it further. Thank you.
Thank you.